Welcome to another episode of the Brookbanks Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wakeling, Head of Cost and Commercial here at Brookbanks. I've got three guests with me today. First is a regular on the Brookbanks Podcast. It's Matt Capper, Director of Utilities. I've also got Jack Kenny. He's an Associate Director in the M&E team at Brookbanks. I'm very pleased to welcome Tom Park, who is Associate Development Director at the Caddick Group with us. And today we're going to be talking about all things electricity demand and network capacity. So I'll start off as we usually do by asking the group to give a quick introduction to themselves. We'll start with you, Matt.
I'm Matt Capper. I'm Director of Utilities at Brookbanks, and I look after the utility consultancy function. In Brookbanks, we support clients with utility constraints and capacity requirements on new developments.
Jack, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Jack Kenny, Associate Director in the M&E Group. Worked on industrial projects for the majority of my career, so the last sort of 10 years or so. And similar to Matt, just helping out clients here and there with M&E design and strategy and getting projects moving forward.
Excellent. And you've combed your hair today, Jack. That's always good to see.
I have. Yeah, I thought I'd put my best foot forward for you today, Ben.
Thanks. And then finally, Tom.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Park. I work for Caddick Developments. Caddick Developments specialise in ground-up development of industrial and logistics, residential, and some special projects. But my expertise lies within the industrial and logistics sector, predominantly in the Northwest and the Midlands.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. And congratulations. You've recently become a father. So congrats to you and your family. I hope everyone's doing well.
Thank you.
Right, Jack, we'll start with you. We're going to be talking about the trends and the kind of drivers that we see at the moment in commercial buildings. What's the latest out there?
Yeah, so there's, I think, a way to sort of frame this is looking at a few different lenses, really. One of them is regulatory, and I'm sure Tom will agree that one of the considerations always for industrial projects is getting the scheme through Part L and passing your energy modelling and your thermal modelling assessment. And because of the sort of minimum requirements we're held to in Part L, it's determining that a lot of services now are going down quite an energy hungry route, shall we say. So if we were to look at sort of 10 years ago, for example, the biggest difference now is we generally don't bring gas into sites, or at least for the base build and the speculative development. And what that means in this sort of current landscape is your heating and hot water generation now is generally going to be through electrical means. So heating, for example, will either be sort of panel heaters through sort of circulation areas, and then we'll have a sort of VRF or VRV air conditioning systems for heating and cooling in the office spaces. And then similarly for your hot water, you're either looking at point of use electric hot water heaters or something larger where you bringing in domestic hot water cylinders, to serve hot water outlets throughout the development. So that's one thing, one sort of lens to look at the sort of current energy trends in the sort of on-plot design, shall we say. Another one, which is quite a large one, and again probably one you're more familiar with, Matt, is the trend in car charging. So car charging now is a real big element to industrial developments. It can be sort of driven by the local authority. So what we commonly see on projects is in the planning agreement around 10% of car park spaces being active chargers. So they have the infrastructure installed as well as the charger, so that from day one you can pull up and plug your car in. And then predominantly the remaining spaces now are seen as passive spaces. So you'll put the duct network in and allow for future install of the chargers. So that's having a real sort of effect, shall we say, on the amount of power that you're now asking for in today's world, rather than say sort of 5 to 10 years ago.
And is that all driven by, you mentioned Part L, there's obviously Future Home Standard as well, which recently was in the news. It's coming into force in 2028. So is that what's driving everything here, Jack? Is that moving away from gas?
Yeah, I mean gas is still used, I believe, for the processing internal processes for when tenants will come on board and fit out large units. But generally, when we're involved from a Cat A base build perspective, you're not bringing gas into the building anymore, and the sort of regulations are driving forward that electrification of the heating and the hot water systems.
Okay, so electricity is the way forward. It's the future then, from what I can gather from what you're saying. But Matt, question for you then is how do electricity network constraints impact on all these new builds, whether it be domestic or commercial or whatever that's going to be so electricity hungry?
Yeah, I think as Tom will know, cost and timescales increase. So industrial logistics schemes are not the only sort of increased demand on the grid. So large residential schemes and existing sort of properties are all vying for additional capacity, and that is leading to sort of quite substantial strain on the grid. So we're seeing increased timescales and increased costs for provision of particularly large connections to sort of the kind of logistic schemes that Tom will be looking at. Within, I think, viewing that within the framework of connections reform, so CP30 that's been sort of brought into play in the last couple of years, sort of largely targeting large generation connections, but equally impacting sort of the provision of large demand connections, in theory making them easier, but actually it's probably introduced a level of uncertainty around how the kind of queue fits together and around the funding of sort of large infrastructure. And then a demand connections reform, which was recently consulted on. I think the consultation closed a couple of weeks ago for that. So sort of funding decisions at sort of BSP and grid level are being delayed, which is impacting large demand connections. And then we're in an economic climate where there's a war in Iran, there's a war in Ukraine, a lot of infrastructure is being sort of diverted to those markets. So timescales and costs associated with large infrastructure is sort of increasing. So all those things are sort of driving significant challenges in our ability to provide sort of large power to schemes, and again, it's a situation that Tom sees across multiple developments, I suppose. So.
Well, let's go to you next then, Tom, and we will come back to the kind of national capacity and whether the country has got the infrastructure in place to kind of keep up with all these demands. But Tom, you've been waiting very patiently. So how does all this impact you as a developer? How do you deal with this kind of uncertainty when trying to get funding to get occupiers, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean it's a very difficult climate that we're operating in now. I mean Matt's obviously touched on the geopolitical uncertainty, but from a UK perspective, power has rapidly become one of the most important and valuable commodities within the I&L market. Occupiers are now requiring increased power capacity to cater for their operations, and they're looking at more automation within the warehouses, electrified cars and van fleets. There's trials now with electrified HGVs. And then with the demand of manufacturers growing, so last year we saw manufacturing demand and take up at about 30% of the overall take up in the UK, which was the highest for a long time. That also brought with it, just picking up on what Jack said about gas, that also brought with it additional gas requirements and connections for the manufacturing processes, which I thought was really interesting. Being a spec developer, that you've got almost a third of your market who potentially are using gas for processing, so that we flip-flop around whether we bring gas to site and cap it at the boundary, or whether we bring it into the units and cap it within the units. And I know that Matt's been on some schemes for us recently where we've decided not to bring gas to the site at all, and it hasn't impacted it. More distribution users, but I think on certain sites we will have to start looking at bringing gas back into sites, just with the stats. The increased electricity requirements, they put demand on the baseline grid, and there is a need for on-site generation, but I don't think we can quite provide the resilience yet within renewable energy, PVs, wind and sort of wave technology to be able to rely on it fully. When I'm speaking to occupiers, it's a very good thing to have renewable energy, but they do want that reliable grid connection.
I think it's always that challenge as well of how sort of enforceable it is, I suppose, or how sort of hard you can push a potential occupier to consider those things, isn't it? I think we do what we can to support Caddick and in turn Caddick do what they can to provide occupiers with an appealing amount of power, I suppose, for a scheme. And there may be situations where occupiers are asking for more than they fundamentally need, and I think we see that across the industry where there's a sort of 20% built-in layer on layer where people are asking for more and more capacity, and you sort of look at numbers sometimes and think, crikey, that's an awfully large number for what you asked for. And when it comes to it, on plot generation and other efficiencies mean that actually they don't need anywhere near that much, but you're trying to appeal to occupiers, so you sort of have to offer them a certain level of capacity availability. So
yeah, it's got a value to it as well, and people don't want to lose it. The funders who we deal with, if you say you're putting a 3 MVA power supply, for instance, into a large unit, they will want the occupier, even if they only use one of it, they'll want the occupier to keep paying the standing charge and keep that 3 MVA into the building because it's got a value to it when they come to sell it or relet it.
Yeah, it's I think a lot of the work that we do is often around maximizing what is available within a threshold, I think, isn't it? And sort of maintaining flexibility is the way that we can build our ability to increase that capacity down the line into what we're doing, whether that be size in primary substations sufficient for potential future demand increases, or installing services down service verges, so that if we have to go in and relay things, it's more cost efficient to do that. There are sort of more experimental things coming in the future, but around sort of centralized on-site generation and things that certain people look at. But I think it's sort of a bit building flexibility in, I think, is sort of the main thing that we do to protect, try and protect clients.
An interesting one, Matt. I mean, how do you see district heating networks having an effect on this? Because sort of, as you say, a large driver now for the M&E design is that typically in an industrial development we're going to have electric heating and electric hot water generation, but with a district heating network you'd abstract that away and almost return to a position where we were before, where you weren't quite beholden to having to size your incoming mains to do everything, because at the moment that's really your size of your supply really has to pick up more or less all of the energy requirements now in a building because of the way that the sort of the regulatory framework has pushed us.
Yeah, I think on INC district heating might be a difficult sell, I think, but there's always that kind of push pull, I suppose, with these things where it's developers or occupiers sort of will start off in a position where it's like, oh, it's not cost effective to do that, or we couldn't provide that on a scheme. But we are finding situations now where sites sort of fundamentally just can't secure the amount of capacity that they need to, or would aspire to get, and therefore we're having to look outside the box on schemes. We might need to look at some sort of centralized energy center with, in some situations, gas engines for a period of time to provide the power, in the interim period while we're waiting for the grid to catch up. And it's things that were previously deemed to be unviable become viable where there is no other alternative, I suppose. And it's we are sort of at that level with some grid constraints where it's just we have no choice but to consider those things, I think.
It's also a tough one with renewables because um, the requirements of Part L are not bad. I mean, you find out that most industrial developments have a really large allocation of PV on roofs, and which is a real positive. But I think, as we sort of alluded to in the conversation, even if we couple a large PV array with battery storage, because of the nature of the weather in the UK, and it can't be relied on. you're not going to go to market with a unit that's got 500 kVA of power and 500 kVA of power from the PV array. It's just going to be seen as 500 kVA, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it is quite tough in that sense, and I think you're right, Matt. It's some of the outside the box thinking has to start coming into it really, especially on some of the constrained sites.
Do you see occupiers, potential occupiers, being willing to have those kind of conversations, Tom, or is it very much a kind of, we need this amount of power, if you can't provide it, we'll go elsewhere sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's latterly what you said there is pretty correct. I think that they want to be they want the PV uh, on the roof, but you're seeing 10%, 20%, or generally, the unit we did together in Leyland, Victorian, it was a speculative development. We put 2 MVA in from the grid. Victorian Plumbing went in, we put 10% PVs on the roof. I think they've increased that to 20%. They use that 20% on site in operations, but the unit roof was so large it could have had a PV array on there, which could, in theory, have generated sort of 3 to 4 MVA of power. Now, if there was a way to harness that, batteries, but we did look into that with the occupier, and the batteries were just they were so big, and the space they took up, we just didn't have that space on site left over. But that's got to be a consideration going forward. I know we've done units where we've almost seeded the power, and we've taken in a smaller amount of power, knowing that in 3 years we can then improve the capacity to the unit, and that's placated some occupiers. But generally, they want a reliable source from the grid, and then PV is a nice bonus. They'll use it for their EV charging, they'll use it for the office heating element potentially, but I don't think they'd end up using it for actual manufacturing operations or distribution operations or automation, because I just don't think it's resilient enough.
Yeah, I think a big thing on the PV really is seen through the lens of it can contribute to saving on your energy bills rather than contributing to your energy resilience and the level of capacity you have.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of that in our marketing particulars as well. You're exactly right, Jack, that that's a big draw, especially as energy prices, with everything which is going on geopolitically, soaring, then I think that's exactly right. And you're seeing more energy efficient buildings. There's a definite flight to quality, and there's definitely some obsolescence. I think units which are 20, 25 years old and older now, we're seeing some real obsolescence, and we're seeing premium rents on the newer buildings, because operationally they're generally higher, so you can rack higher, but you also save, so you might be paying 20, 25, 30% more on your rent, but actually on your energy costs, if you're a high energy user, you can save that quite quickly.
So you're having to, it sounds to me as a layperson who probably understood about 30% of what you all just said in the last 10 minutes, that the gas isn't dead. There's still a place for it, but one of the main headaches that you will have is trying to future-proof existing schemes and new schemes without really maybe knowing what the future really holds in terms of specifically electricity demand. I'd like to talk a bit about data centers. They're occasionally in the news, but they're obviously a huge focus at the moment with everything going on with AI and so on, requiring the huge amounts of power needed for it. I don't know how many data centers are springing up around the UK at the moment, but does that, Tom, play a factor in how you deal with sites and the demand required?
I mean, Caddick Developments as a business is a developer trader, so we'll always look for the highest value use for the site. Whether that be data center, whether that be automation, distribution, whatever it is, we'll always apply for planning on that basis. However, data centers, we can't really let it detract from the original sort of plan of B2B8 consent necessarily, because within the north, within the markets I work in, they're few and far between. They're so power hungry. Matt and I, we have a site which we think we have large power. Matt's done a lot of work on it for us. We think we can get to sort of 200, 250 MVA, but to actually get to the point of understanding whether you can get to that power capacity, you're talking millions of pounds and committing to millions of pounds more. So without an end user in tow, it's really, really difficult to do the viability studies properly to what the end users want to actually see. A lot of sites just aren't viable. There aren't the grid connections there to be able to even seed that amount of power. We've read in the press and heard in the market that data centers will take 30 to 50 MVA to seed a site, and as long as there's a route through in the next 10 years to get to the hundreds of MVAs. So I think whilst the land values that have been reported in the press are sometimes double what industrial logistics land values typically are, I think they're it's a very, very difficult site to unlock for a data center user. So I think as a developer, we just have to carry on as if it was a industrial logistics development and with an eye on data centers. And if a data center occupier pops up, then obviously we'll entertain the idea.
Yeah, I think that there's a big challenge in the distribution queue as well, demand queue. I think with knowing sort of what's really a data center prospect and what's not. I think there are parts of the country where you would expect there to be more data center applications that have queues of 10, 15, 20 sort of data center connections, which are which are unlikely to come forward altogether. That's driving timescales out, and there is a specific mention in the sort of current Ofgem demand connections reform consultation about dealing with data centers entirely separately from the rest of the demand queue and sort of finding a way to sort of resolve that. And I think that is it sort of feels like in some areas that we are sort of past the boom almost from a data center power perspective, where there's so much in the queue and we're so far. If we're making sort of applications now for those kind of schemes, we're almost too late in some parts of the country. I think that is driving data centers, edge data centers and sort of smaller data centers to locations which are sort of less what you would think of as a traditional data center location, so not on the sort of outskirts of London or not on the outskirts of Manchester, but in sort of more remote locations, usually co-located with sites where there are decommissioned power facilities, old power stations, docklands, where there's sort of large power infrastructure already there, and it's more cost effective to sort of make use and repurpose that than it is to sort of bring an entirely new connection into an area. But I think data centers are, people aspire to have them on schemes, I think, but how feasible it is on the vast majority of sites to actually deliver one is not, it's not sort of something that you can always rely on, I think. So.
I feel like, and I'm not an aficionado on the technology of data centers, but I feel like the chips and the fins that are put into data centers are going to get more efficient and they're going to get smaller anyway. So in theory, if you think of a mobile phone 20 years ago and you look at your mobile phone now, they're completely different products, aren't they? And I think that's how data centers are going to go and how they're going to have to operate if they need to operate in the UK, which clearly they do. So I do think that the chips will become more efficient and potentially the energy consumption that they're required will lessen.
We've talked a bit about data centers, but there are other, I suppose, non-traditional occupiers that also require a lot of demand. We're sort of seeing requests, I think, for sort of co-located EV charging hubs with Costas and things like that. Other coffee brands are available. Is that a consideration, Tom, as well? Are those sort of frequent requests you're getting on schemes for transport related sort of large power, or is that sort of less frequent than even data centers?
No, it's more frequent you can imagine. In fairness, big online retailers, the biggest in the world who you can probably all name, they probably, we hear from them probably once a quarter, if not more, for EV charging for their vans, with a small warehouse. So warehouse can be filled up overnight, vans can be filled up overnight, and then they can go off in their EV fleet and do their do their rounds during the day and their deliveries during the day. So, and they're very, very land hungry and they're very, very power hungry. You've got a requirement at the minute from another online retailer who want 15 acres. They want a small 50,000 square foot unit, and the rest of it being EV van charging. So you're probably talking the best part of 12 acres worth of van charging. Obviously, that has its problems with planning as well as power, but the power requirement on that was quite significant.
So, and if you were a developer and there was a big data center being built down the road, or some other kind of power hungry um, project, and you're a developer and you're a bit worried about electricity network capacity, what's the first thing, other than calling you Matt or you Jack or you Tom, what's the first thing that the developer should do to ease their mind about these kinds of worries?
How Caddick developments work is we secure sites at an early stage, so it's quite difficult for us to secure power very, very early. And holding on, if we do secure it, then holding on to the capacity is even tougher. Um, and by the time things have progressed, we often find that the closest POC that we thought was there is potentially already at capacity, so we have to just go further afield. But I think to answer your question is you need to put your money down, you need to secure a POC, and you need to try and hold on to that capacity for as long as you can do. Matt seems to have a good art at being able to hold on to capacity for us, so it's quite good to have in our armory.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that that's the way the industry's driven, because all the regulations and everything that we're told by DNOs is set up to discourage us from doing that. It continues to get harder, milestones get more difficult to meet. The drive is towards sort of kind of just in time connections, I suppose, and sort of provision of connections. But the counterpoint to that is that these connections take much longer, cost more money. There's a lack of certainty around the cost delivery. So the sort of there isn't a sort of function or a process within the sort of DNO application side really that sort of ticks boxes sufficiently that gives developers confidence that they can leave connection applications to a later date. So we're all stuck in this world, kind of playing this game of sort of trying to secure capacity early, knowing that really the industry kind of doesn't want us to do that, and fundamentally we're probably making it worse by doing that. But we have no choice, because a developer needs certainty on cost, they need certainty on delivery, and without that they can't bring a scheme forward, they can't fund the scheme, they can't deliver the scheme. So it's a really difficult balance, I think, and it's one obviously that the industry is trying to address with connections reform and sort of legislative reform. But that reform appears to be sort of largely just making the situation more difficult to do what we're doing in terms of securing capacity, and it doesn't seem to be taking the views, I think, of developers and their sort of needs around certainty and funding and sort of demonstrating viability into account when they're looking at these changes. I think there's still some way to go to get us to where we need to be on that front, I think.
I think the planning system itself is adding pressure to the POCs and the milestones you've got to hit within them, because most major applications that we put in now are taking longer than the 13-week determination period. Now, if they did take the 13-week determination period, then you'd be absolutely fine, securing your POC and hitting your milestones. But the planning system's creating a bit of a tricky balance really between applying early and taking on the cost risk, or potentially waiting and losing the access to the power. And it's a real fine balance as a developer on which way you go. You can potentially secure your POC early and just look at it that you may well lose some money if it does get retracted from you, and that tends to be the way that we go, because without the power, the scheme isn't viable, the scheme isn't developable.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We are almost out of time. So the final question, I'll just throw this out to the group. We've talked a lot about the current situation. I'm mindful that even 10, 15 years ago, EV chargers are rarely heard of. Solar panels weren't as prevalent as they are now. So let's think 10, 15 years into the future. What where do we see the market going? What are the kind of emerging occupier demands, emerging technologies? What is there to look forward to in the realm of electricity demand?
A bit of a left field idea, but there is a lot of studies going on with hydrogen at the moment up and down the country. So the gas network infrastructure that exists is worth billions of pounds, and I believe that there's a current scheme going on where they've rebuilt a small town in Loughborough to use the gas infrastructure to push through a hydrogen blend into houses and into developments to see how they go with heating their homes and generating hot water with a hydrogen blend. So I think that will be a future trend, and I think it will help ease some of that electrical demand, shall we say, on servicing the developments.
Yeah, I think if hydrogen's going to work somewhere, it's probably going to be on I&C schemes. I think the recent housing implementations have struggled. I think a couple of them have ended up being pulled, and I think there are sort of challenges around the implementation, particularly of pure hydrogen solutions on schemes. But where there are manufacturing or demand needs for I&C schemes, it seems much more viable that might be a technology that we see in the not too distant future. I think co-location of I&C schemes with hydrogen storage systems. There's a sort of schemes around the northwest across sort of Runcorn and Helsby and up into the north where there are pipelines installed that sort of broadly co-located with storage. May provide that kind of manufacturing demand requirement. But I think the general trend with a lot of this stuff, and my sort of personal feeling is, electrification of most of these things is usually the most simple solution to most stuff. I think even when we're considering district heating on residential sites potentially, it is a solution, but it's a solution that adds more complexity, more pipes, and sort of fundamentally electrification is usually the simplest solution, obviously within the context of the lack of electricity demand. So I think we'll see situations where developers end up having to find solutions which are likely to include batteries, PV, gas engines, potentially for short periods of time to plug gaps where there isn't capacity availability. All those things are very expensive and they're difficult to sort of, I think, justify from a viability perspective. Particularly battery storage is particularly expensive where you're just using it to offset lack of demand. But I do sort of think that those kind of technologies, backed up potentially by things like smart grids, where you can sort of commute the kind of generation and spread it across a development, it probably will end up being the sort of where we go in the kind of short to medium term whilst we wait for the grid to catch up, I think.
If batteries can become smaller and more efficient, and PVs can become more efficient, then actually I think that will help massively. And I think there's a learning curve for funders and occupiers to go on with battery storage to potentially, once the technology has improved, to potentially show how resilient it can be. I know that we're quite a grey, rainy country, but we still do get enough sunny days, I think, as long as we can harness that potential. And as Matt said, sort of smart grids on multi-unit sites would be quite an interesting concept, I think. And potentially distributing the power between from bigger buildings to smaller buildings and sort of offsetting the costs somehow.
Excellent, thank you. Really appreciate your time, everybody. We are unfortunately out of time. So if anybody listening would like to get in touch to find out more, how can they get in contact with you? We'll start with you, Matt.
As per almost everybody in the industry, I think the easiest place to get me is probably LinkedIn. So save sharing specific contact details. You can message me on there and I will respond.
Jack, how about you?
Yeah, just the same as Matt. Active on LinkedIn, so if anybody wants to get in touch, just drop me a message and I'll get back to you.
Good. And then Tom, how about you? How's best to get in touch?
Yeah, same. Active on LinkedIn or on email. My email's tom.park@caddick.co.uk. So however anyone wants to get in touch.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your chat. Thank you for your time. It remains me to say thank you to Matt Capper, to Jack Kenny, and to Tom Park. And we'll see you next time for another Brookbanks podcast.